Manual. Huh? Oh.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
How are you this late afternoon?
Beautiful.
I'm Rob Dutoff. I'm the provost at UW Apartheid. Welcome to this event by the Center for Research and Innovation in Smart Cities. I like the description of what the center does on the website. I'll read for you. The Center for Research and Innovation in Smart Cities has been created to bring individuals together to leverage the power of people working with technology to make our communities better. The process starts with bringing people together to create awareness, leveraging our educational resources, and driving innovation through collaboration. I also want to say how appreciative we are of the Tommy Thompson Center. If it weren't for the Tommy Thompson
brief remarks before we begin myself. So I'm Alex Goff, the director of the Tommy T. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. So the Thompson Center is really delighted to be able to sponsor today's event and to work with everybody here at Parkside. And I want to thank Chancellor, thank Dean James, and everybody here for making this possible. And we're really delighted to have Shane here on campus. If you're not already listening to her podcast, I highly suggest that you do, for reasons you'll see tonight. And I also want to thank Ruth and Tia, the staff at the Thompson Center, for also helping make this possible. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, we were established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Thompson, who works with both sides of the aisle to promote and further good public policy. We seek to carry on its legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, promoting effective public policy, and fostering leadership skills. And to further these goals, we conduct a variety of activities throughout the UW system, including sponsoring speakers and hosting events, funding scholarships, funding research, and other things. We are currently soliciting proposals for both research grants and speaker grants. And so if you are affiliated with a UW school, as I assume many of you are, I highly encourage you to consider applying for some of those. This year we are particularly interested in topics of education and learning loss, issues facing rural Wisconsin, and state and local government relations, but we also welcome applications really dealing with any aspect of public leadership. So for more information about our upcoming events, about our grant opportunities, and anything else about the center, I encourage you to visit our website. And now I'm really pleased to turn it over to the Dean of the Social Sciences.
Got it.
Thank you. And fellow political scientists.
Yes, that's right. That's all that matters.
Dean James, thank you.
Well, thank you. Just a couple things before we start. Shane and I are going to have a conversation about some issues that I think are really interesting. And so probably I will forget all about you for the next hour or so. And what I'd like to ask is that if you have questions, either if you're online or if you're here in person, is that you hold on to those questions until we're finished, and then we can field questions for a little bit. And after that, Shane has kindly agreed to network with folks and maybe answer some questions on a one-on-one basis afterwards, but only after I buy her a glass of wine first. So you need to give her that little bit of leeway after that. So I'm going to get started, and I had given Shane some of these questions, and now I realize I want to start with a different question. But it's going to be easy, I think, because if any of you have looked at Shane's podcasts and you know all of the things that you've been doing for years, is that you obviously have a passion and an enthusiasm for technology and for policy. Why?
So I was very lucky. I started representing a company called VeriSign that still to this day runs .com and .net. At the time, they also ran .org. And I was not native. I'm not an engineer. I was working for the liquor industry before this, and where there's a weird nexus point there is that when you work in the distilled spirits or anything in the alcohol business, you have to know about the 3-tier system, which means you have to know a lot about interstate commerce. And that was weirdly my thing. When I went to interview, they were like, okay, we're going to start connecting people, and people are going to start talking to each other, and we're selling these domain names, and how can you help? And I was like, well, I understand how we have to deal with transport. There's only certain things you can do, and there's laws, and there's state laws and all these. And that was this weird nexus point for me to be able to walk into the world of internet policy. And the other thing is I'm a super curious cat, and that's one of the reasons why I have my podcast, is then I was like, I'm all in. Now, I was also very lucky when I was in the distilled spirits, I would go and meet all the master distillers. because why not? I could. And so, I would just go in and ask a million questions. Why this, not that? So when I started, I would just go in and talk to the engineers. And my biggest challenge was, it was like I would walk in and they'd be like, eek, this is math class, cheerleading's down the hall. Like they just, like I was in the wrong room, And then slowly we were gotten, there were no real rules to the road to what we were doing. And so, what's really interesting, and it's a book that I don't think has really been written yet, is how we were all just making it up until someone told us to stop. So you would just kind of get guidance. I mean, we didn't know, the zeros and ones only, know the path you put them on. They don't know that there's like supposed to be a hard stop on certain things. So the idea of bringing in governance, which has become a big thing now, we hear about governance a lot, but how we managed information was, to me, the most important thing was understanding the flow. Mm-hmm. So I'd talk to the engineers and say, how does this work? And they would, and I was not a whiteboard girl at all until I got into this. And now I immediately want to whiteboard everything. So they would get up and they would start whiteboarding something to me. And then I would say, well, what happened here? And they go, that's your fault. I said, how's that my fault? I just arrived. And they said, it's a policy decision was made that made us deviate from where we would have natively gone as engineers. And that really, really resonated with me, because I was like, ooh, we shouldn't mess this stuff up if we don't have to. And I just really kind of doubled down on my passion about how you need to train policy people, legislators, governors, whoever's listening to you, ministers, about why we don't legislate technology. You legislate a policy outcome. Mm-hmm. And so I love what I do.
And that leads us perfectly, I think, into actually what was supposed to be the first question. And Chris, or our Center for Research and Innovation in Smart Cities, is really down that particular road, is that while we know technology is important, there are plenty of centers around that look at connected systems and their test beds and things. But what we focus on primarily is the politics, the social aspects, the citizens. And so one of the things, too, that I think is really interesting about all this tech research is that in the beginning for cities, that there was just a lot of emphasis on, oh, that's cool. Let's do that. Let's implement that. Why are we doing it? Because we can. And I don't think people were thinking of the impact on citizens, whether or not people really wanted to use it. And so for you're interested in the policy and policy advocacy. What would you think are some primary considerations that we should have when we're developing a strategy for technology in the public sector?
So we all like to solve for the problem. And so I had to keep a list because there were just so many fun things to choose from here. Unlike where technology a lot of times gets enamored with just the technical capability of doing something. When you're starting to solve with a planning process, there's a lot of things that need to come to mind. And so I actually went and reviewed to see what a lot of other, not only cities, but governments are doing. And it gets interesting when you ask the question of, okay, what are your goals? And these are some of the top, kind of key goals that people said they were working on. Decent work and economic growth in their area. Good health and well-being. Mm-hmm. Reduced inequalities, gender equality, sustainability goals, zero hunger, resiliency, planning, risk and analysis. So these get away from what we typically think of as something when you're doing the if-then-what scenario for a technological outcome, to realize there's these human elements which take a lot of data, preferably, or you're doing a lot of guessing and assuming into a network. And so I think that the marriage between the ability to understand and get the qualified data and then lay it into the technological aspect is really important, to have both that yin and yang there.
And I wonder, as you say, it's not necessarily linear, is it? Is that you have all of those different issues coming in, that they might come in at different points in time. As you said with your example, your whiteboard example, change the process or the flow, and so now you've got a completely different problem that you need to be able to legislate or regulate or do whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also, since I'm not being a trained engineer, it's funny how my brain goes to it now. Like some days I'm like, I can't make that decision. I don't have enough data. And it's like which shoe to wear, and I'm like, is it going to rain? I don't know. So it does get very interesting the more you train. So I also, in the area of cybersecurity, I'll always tell people the most important cybersecurity element is the one you'll use. So people don't like friction. And if you put too many friction points in a process, especially for cyber, they won't do two-factor authentication. They can't remember their password. So they'll take the things that are the easiest native elements to protection and they'll take that away. It's similar to data. If you don't understand the data sets that somebody puts in front of you, you're not apt to use them in your decision-making process. So the idea that what you're building here is to create probably very data native people. They've kind of grown up with it by the time you're training them into this. But understanding what is a relevant data point. Sorry, I was a data, I can't make up my mind. But I noted here like confirmation bias. I was thinking about some of the work you do in politics, and we tend to like to assume that things are the way we like them, and then you go out and you find the data points to show I'm right. Well, that's not always the best way to make a decision. And so I think that more training we have, and then making sure that everyone is trained on the capability of understanding the data. So otherwise, if doing a lot of really cool data sets and then they just sit somewhere because they were not built into the process is a sad failure for me, because I know how hard it is to collect all that data.
Yeah. So, but all of our policymakers or officials or our government, they're not data scientists. So how do we help them to become at least maybe not data scientists, but as you're sort of describing, data aware, data informed, knowing what questions they can ask? I mean, are these things that should be important for our policymakers?
So I'm going to, again, lead to a little bit of what Alex is, the work he's done is that most politicians, I'll call them, versus policy people are very good at understanding how polls work. They know, what people like, they don't like. They can get down to that very finite point of understanding. I'm down to 6 people who I don't know if they like me or not. Like everybody else, they're like, you don't like me, I don't want to talk to you. You love me, that's great. So who are these 6 people? So I think when we do the data, a lot of it is trying to understand, like setting up early on the agreement, what we're solving for. And then going after the data points that are going to be relevant, and then finding that the information inflection where the politicians / policymakers will accept the data. If you do it in a fashion that they're like, oh, that never works. You're not going to get them to pay attention, then you might as well not spend money on it, because it's not going to be of value.
So how can we frame things that are understandable in a data format for policymakers or legislators to actually be able to respond to that?
So buy-in. Buy-in is huge. Now, this is a funny little thing, but you guys have to go with me on this, and I swear you're going to start watching him. So I was out in Colorado. My dad's side of the family lives in Colorado, and I have 4 half-brothers who are obsessed with a show called Post 10 that is on YouTube, and it is about this guy who gets very frustrated that he doesn't think the crews in his town in Massachusetts do a good job of clearing out the ability for the water to get through when there's a storm. And so he takes basically a Home Depot rake. I mean, it's just like a prong rake. He finds where the water is clogged, and the best part of this is people can't get in the middle of the street, so they're driving on the sidewalk, which would never occur to me. And he goes in with his rake, and within like minutes, he's cleared the process, and the water is draining the way the engineers designed it for, but it's just a frustrated guy with a rake, right? So you're like, what if we actually had sensors in those areas, and you could say, okay, we know that this is our one little, fixation point when we have a big storm, and everybody, all the traffic gets backed up, and then the whole area becomes like a great big traffic jam. One guy with a rake fixed it.
So is that how we get buy-in then? We sort of go with a very specific example that people can see, just like the one that you gave us.
I watch Post 10 and I want to give everybody a rake. I mean, I just want people to solve for the problem. Like once you realize that the problem wasn't that complicated, it was just that somebody's not focusing on that one juggernaut point. And I think when you can get more information, so they're like, oh, if we clear that, then we don't have the 5 o'clock rush hour during the summer storms.
Right. And that's what, of course, all these sensors can do for us, is that they can be places that we're not often there, and they can give us that information so we can do just-in-time interference, I suppose, and do that. They did that in Chicago. They put sensors on the inside of dumpsters in the alleys because they had a big problem with rats, and they couldn't follow it. So they put sensors on that would indicate when baby rats were being born, so that they knew to get them. And it's kind of bad. It makes me feel bad for the baby rats. But they would go and get rid of them before they became adults, to where they would, obviously. But it's all about being being there at the right time, and that's what sensors can do for you.
I gave you this example when you and I were first talking and this is a very rudimentary app. Early on in Boston, somebody created an app, and now it's for the privacy side of my brain. Like there's probably so much that they shouldn't have gathered on this, but you would open the app on your way to work, you'd lay it in your passenger seat, and every time it had a geolocation point. If you went over a pothole, it would bounce. And so this information would go back to the city, and that way, ideally, the city would be spending their time filling potholes, not driving around looking for potholes. Very simple.
And this is passive collection, right? The
Right.
citizen didn't actually have to report anything. They just put
Now,
their
we
app
don't know
on.
if the data brokers got information off of that app after they didn't close it once they got to work. That's what worries me now, but that's 10 years later thinking about that.
So in terms of technological innovation, what do you think would be the best level to really successfully implement this? And we've got the national level where there's all sorts of policy issues that are being discussed, and then there's the state level, so we have smart states, as it were. But most of this is being talked about at the local level. We're talking about smart cities as really the location to actually have successful implementation of technology. Do you think that the cities are really the places to begin?
Yeah, because I think most of the challenges are probably local and always will have an element that is important to that city that may not replicate. So I think of Las Vegas. Las Vegas has sensors that are for environmental. If it's the heat of the summer and you have too many vehicles idling, they will then change the traffic patterns to push more traffic throughout that area. And that was actually a study that was done by Brookings, which is a think tank that's next door to us. But they brought Brookings in to work on processes like that. Another thing that they realized is while Brookings was there, was that they have so many international flights that they should take advantage of doing more international biology testing for they just took all this data and said there's a lot of people that are sending things to areas that don't make sense and they time out, so you want a faster ability to bring information in and out. Okay. And you have flights from Japan, flights from China at one point, all these different places, and then you could get the information into one center. And so they created a whole corridor of labs that now exist right outside of the Las Vegas, they just recently changed the name of it. Used to be the Karen
McCarran, yeah.
So it's now a Harry Reid, but it was something that they realized while they were there, there's a couple other things you guys could be thinking about. Well, that may not work in Kenosha, but there may be something that's going on in this area that you're gonna have a better sense about how that's going on. It's always good to get federal money, but they shouldn't have all those federal strings.
And that's what I mean, with a lot of the smart city innovations, they talk about the aspect of it being personalized. In other words, it's sort of ubiquitous, but it's still very personal to whoever is using it at that particular time, and that's essentially the same analogy you're using. But is there a role for let's say the national government in some of this technological implementation?
Yeah, there's a new group that started last year that is, a colleague of mine that used to work at NVIDIA, who's been doing a lot of work on artificial intelligence, realized that we're still very much on the coast as far as the way that we're creating artificial intelligence programs. So it's Carnegie Mellon, it's Boston, it's Stanford, and he said, there's a lot of things to solve for that is very local, and so they've created a group called Seed AI, and I'm gonna owe this to Peggy because I was not able to come up with data specifically for this area, but what they're trying to do is create better ways to start teaching artificial intelligence so you can utilize it within a local environment. And it's the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is actually championing this. They have a wonderful woman who works there, and then NIST, which is out of the Department of Commerce, and they are working on funding to bring it into some sort of localized area. If you can basically make the use case, there's a good chance that you're going to be one of the entities. Plus, they want to regionalize it. What's important in the Southwest is not necessarily the same thing that's important in the Northeast. Yeah.
Right. And I think that oftentimes when people talk about smart city innovation or AI or any of that, oftentimes your examples, your use cases are the bigger cities who might have a little bit more money to work with, or and they can afford to try something out. But in the Midwest especially, but really throughout the country, most of our population lives in small to mid-sized urban areas, and so they need to have that technological innovation situation as well, and having some assistance from outside would probably be very helpful.
Well, especially with AI, it's patterns. You just start to notice patterns of behavior where it just makes sense. You're like the slightest little tweak. I think it was Reno that did a study that showed there were just had a couple intersections where majority of their accidents are happening. And it was a left turn into full traffic. And of course, everybody's resistant to change something to a one-way street. But they did a couple of major streets where they went from, all one way, so you're going left to a left, and it alleviated a major percentage of their traffic problems.
And it just learns, right? I mean, through a neural network, it learns from its mistakes, and it will learn very quickly. And I think we all learn from our mistakes too, but sometimes it takes, that's true, but sometimes it takes 3 or 4 times to make that mistake before you even realize it. I know Foxconn actually developed an AI system for Hong Kong when they were overloaded with people coming to the emergency room primarily for lung issues, and I can't remember why, but they were just lines and lines. And what they did was that they would have an AI interpret their X-rays and basically do triage. In the beginning, it was like a 50% error rate, but 2 weeks later, it was up to 95% accuracy because it learned, and of course, just like us, but it just learns really quickly.
Yeah, the data actually on healthcare is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
You have to have that human interaction. You have to have just to refine it in the beginning. But once they feel like they've got it into a good, you always need that. I'm a big believer in the Pareto principle, the 80-20. Like if you're at the 80% and you need to have that human interaction. One of our bigger concerns is when we want to push everything to the machines and then we want to walk away. And I feel like anytime you're in one of those do loops because you're trying to talk to somebody and then you just keep getting into the 1-800 I can't get out of here cycle, you need to keep some element of the human loop in there. But for the most part, a lot of it can be more accurately done by a pretty smart machine.
Right. So a final question on this sort of strategic policy question is there a point where we'll have so much technology, so much connectivity, I think, that the role of a government, for instance, may actually fundamentally change, where citizens are rather than being served or rather than being passive participants, are actually really taking a greater part in running things, and government is more of a platform rather than actually an actor?
I think we'll see that with 5G. And I know 5G has been such a marketing ploy, and I love my friends at AT&T, but I wanted to kill them when they came out with 5G evolution, which just upped everybody's thought process, which the technology wasn't there yet. But we're getting there. Verizon's been ahead of schedule on their adoption of getting 5G out into counties. There is an area where there's all kinds of fun stories about why so-and-so got more 5G connectivity, and then another one. We actually have a local one in Washington. That's actually about FiOS, but Verizon wanted to go into Alexandria, which is just south of Washington, D.C., and the city was just sure they could get them for all this money, and finally Verizon was like, see ya. And they went to Arlington, and by the time I was living in Arlington, I loved my FiOS. It was really fast, and I would just love to lord it over my friends who lived in Alexandria. I was like, you're never getting FiOS, because they just made a bad decision at the city level at that point. But I think that and we have so many digital natives now, that the idea of like, the minute you get a hiccup and you're like, something doesn't go through, you get like a panic, like, is my phone working? And you're like, no, it's just actually every once in a while you get an area where it's just slightly slower than you think it should be. But the connectivity is going to be amazing. So
you're saying what 5G does to connectivity will mean that everybody can participate, everybody can do it cleanly, everybody can do it quickly, and that could fundamentally change the way we do things.
Humans don't like to hear this, but 5G is really for the machines.
I'm sorry?
The 5G is really for the machines. It's going to make the machines talk to each other faster.
Okay.
We'll benefit because things will ultimately become faster, but it's not actually about us. But it will allow so then it'll become more native to the infrastructure, and people that have the infrastructure will have success at a rate that people that do not have the infrastructure will be lagging. And it may be a little bit to make that connection as to why that is, but that is where the technology will really make a big difference.
Interesting. So we might actually have some changes in the way we do, well, business certainly, but governing as well, probably, if we can do that. You think it'll make our citizens more active citizens? Or do you
Gosh, I don't know
think
if
that that's
that's
still a
possible.
whole other issue?
I feel like, we're the last couple election cycles have shown that you can be very active. If the challenge is the active-passive.
Yes.
As somebody who lives in the District of Columbia, I feel like I always vote. I've never not voted. My mother, got that into me early. But I'm never sure that my vote actually counts for anything. But I still vote. Like, I think you have to.
Right.
So I think, one of the things I work a lot on content on the internet and the disinformation and misinformation campaigns. The thing that makes me the most sad about them is the way that people have gotten frustrated and disengaged. And that's a challenge as much as the over-engagers.
Right, right. So we're talking about 5G, you're mentioning the internet. Tell us about Web 3.
Ooh, the Web 3, yes, the webs. The interwebs, as I always like to think, and the tubes.
We need music.
So, right. So Web 1 was the initial connectivity. It was the vint surfs and, the www finding the HTTP. And this is very exciting, and we all, the machines learned how to talk to each other, and they really, I've gone out of my way to try to meet everybody who was in that first generation, the graveyards, because, and I've done some great interviews where I'm like, what were you thinking? And, Vint Cerf will say, we all knew each other. Why would I put security on? It just didn't occur to us, right? And he'll say we were wrong. We should have had some forward, we were just so excited it worked. Yeah. So that's Web 1, was just the initial, think about AOL, think about the sound of your modem going off. And then Web 2 became what we're currently into, which is the platforms, the idea of the cross function. And that was still web, and then we slowly migrated to mobile. Mobile was a huge change in the game. And you even think early Facebook wasn't designed for mobile. And then you have things that have come up since then, like Instagram is mobile native, and everything on the Instagram platform is designed for mobile and back ends into web. Where that's made a big difference is in security, actually, that your phone and everything about your device, because you actually know more about, you're on a mobile carrier, right? You're on T-Mo, you're on one of the carriers. They have skin in the game on not wanting your device to go down. When you're on a combination of an enterprise, most enterprise systems do pretty well, but you have a different risk factor. And so it's interesting because the security is thought to be less native on the device, the actual PC, and it's more to the network.
Okay.
And so that's where you see that, like, mobile's still pretty tight, and you don't want your phone to go down. I mean, most of our world is on our phone. So it's that idea of how do we get the second web level, Web 2, to the tightness of what is becoming mobile into Web 3. Web 3 is kind of like the 5G evolution, is a lot more discussion about crypto, the disaggregation of things, distributed ledgers, blockchain. Did I use enough buzzwords there? It's that whole world of people that want to go to a different level. I loved crypto early on because I used to travel a lot internationally, and I love the idea, in theory, of there being less friction to move my money from dollars to Deutschmarks, or it's now a euro, but that whole idea, it's now gone to a whole nother level, and we're starting to see the friction come back in, and you're paying, if you're in the NFT world, you're paying gas fees. And that means I'm paying to do a transfer to a transfer. Well, that wasn't the original idea with crypto.
Right.
We were trying to get away from those friction points. And as when you look at a lot of the transfer from different parts of the United States to like Latin or South America, there are still, the percentage that people pay to send money back home is really significant. So I loved the idea that we could find a way to make that money be cash in your mother or your grandmother's pocket, and not part of that is something else. So we're still working through a lot of that, big regulatory questions around all of that, because banking likes to be regulated.
Right, and I'm looking at crypto now. That for me, this is a new term. It's stable coin, and something that actually is a cryptocurrency that is a regulator or a stabilizer to the ups and downs of cryptocurrency. It seems like it's almost serving a bank function or even a Fed function.
Yeah. So stablecoin and the idea that it's tied to a fiat currency. So early on, when Facebook Meta was trying to play in this space, they decided they'd put this basket together of I think it was like 17 different fiat currencies. It was way overthought. They put way too many smart people in a room together because it just failed miserably. But they were on to, like, they were trying to get ahead of the regulators and ask for a blessing. And the market didn't want that to go that direction. But you are seeing like Coinbase is working very closely with the regulators. I've spoken to some of their people there, former SEC. So they understand just baseline regulation. And they're like, we want to be the one that everyone trusts. That's great. There are a lot of people in the crypto space who are like, if I never speak to a government official, like how long can I get away with this? Somebody called me last week and they're like, well, you're a libertarian. You should love this idea. And I'm like, I don't love criminals. I just don't. So I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't think making things so much easier for the criminal element is good for our economy or anybody's economy. So it's a really fun, feisty discussion going on in the crypto space.
Well, and it seems like it's a completely different world for that. They talk about, actually, I just read an article today about insurance companies that were traditional insurance companies that were financed, but there were also these companies that were insurance for risk taken in the cryptocurrency range, and then would actually use the stable coin to help minimize that risk. So it's like two different systems are actually happening. And you kind of wonder which one will win.
Well, now there's also bridge companies. You're like, that's what we were trying to get away from, right? You're like, why am I now talking to a bridge company so my stable coin can talk to my, whatever I'm in, ETH, whichever one I choose.
So getting back about the Web3 though, so what's the big difference between Web3 and Web 2?
Most of it is, I would say it's the people that wish they had been smarter earlier on. They're mad that the platforms are the platforms. So, and we're seeing this a little bit with Elon Musk right now, today, right? We were having this conversation a little bit earlier, I think Elon Musk is smart, and what I think he's doing is saying, I don't need to go out and build a new platform. I like Twitter. I just don't like the people who are running it. So I'm going to buy enough to push out the board, right? And I'm like, if I get an edit button, I'm all for it. That's my own stake in the game. But so it'll be curious to see if he wins. We've seen True Social, all these groups that tried to pop up in the last Getter, the blah, 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 blah. And they have not been able to get critical mass to get to a point where they got enough people that they could be at a level of a Facebook or an Instagram, or I call LinkedIn Facebook for adults. I mean, I think there's an element of that. They don't consider themselves completely a platform, but they are. So I think with Web3, there's people trying to guess how to go there next. But the people one fun thing about being in a think tank is people just want to talk to you all the time, and I'm like, bring it. If I got time, I'll talk to you or listen, really, which is, again, this is my podcast. And they're Frank McCourt, who used to own the LA Dodgers. Do I get that right, Mr. Baseball? Okay. He then lost it to his ex-wife, and that was a whole other story. But so he's very big on a group called I'm getting it wrong, Unsomething, and we went in and talked to them, and his whole thing is it's like unbridled or untethered, and he just wants everything to be decentralized. Well, that's great if you're in this utopian environment where everybody kind of knows where to find things, but that brings us almost back to Web 1, where you had to figure out how to connect to each other.
Right.
We're beyond that. It's like I tell people, there's certain age generation, I'm like, you don't have to put www anymore. And they're like, you don't?
No.
Nope, we figured that part out. That's just part of the browser process now.
Yeah. So there was a piece, I think, that in Newsweek, where you were with Ivana Stratner, I think. And you're talking about Biden and how he was focusing on renewing democracy in the United States and around the world, and we're doing that kind of, maybe, sort of now. But then the statement was, but he should include the place where the biggest threat to democracy is emerging, the internet. That's kind of scary stuff.
So there's a lot going on there. I wrote a piece a couple weeks ago, again, going back to my roots in the domain name addressing business, is there was a whole group of people that wanted the domain name, and we think of .com, which is commercial. We don't use .us the way that other countries do. So it's very common in you're coming out of Russia, you're using .ru, or there's a Cyrillic thing that I honest to God couldn't figure out how to do on my keyboard, so I just didn't put it in the article. I did figure out how to do a couple of things, and then there's .su. So the Soviet Union is still in our domain name system, which is kind of a quirk. But they wanted them to be taken out by the governing entity, which is ICANN, the Internet Corporation on Assigned Names and Numbers. And I wrote a piece backing up the board saying that is not the best thing to do when it is our most capable communications mechanism. Why should we cut the Russian people off because of what their government is doing? And there's a lot of debate around that. The other thing is that Russia is not designed like China. China really did figure out how to put a firewall around their citizens. Russia doesn't have it quite figured out like that, but Russia would have loved us to try to cabin them off because they would have reverse engineered that into a Chinese system if they could. So for somebody who's a lover of democracy, and I don't think that it's the Russian people's fault that we're at war right now, or they're at war with the Ukraine, I thought it's very important that we keep the gateway of the internet open to the Russian people.
So you're saying is that we need to actually, that could encourage democracy if we actually keep the connection or the engagement there, which actually I think there was a Clinton policy many years ago that talked about constructive engagement.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I remember that correctly, but this on the internet, right? Yeah. So we're still on the internet, and of course we could probably talk about the internet for ages, but cybersecurity. This is one of the biggest concerns. When I talk to people, this is really what they're concerned mostly about is cybersecurity, having that, not only their money taken or their finances, but their identities hacked, which I think is perhaps even more of a risk factor these days. Should there be, is it coming, some sort of large national policy on cybersecurity or on strategies to engage in that particular area?
Yeah, identity management is becoming a bigger and bigger issue because it is tied so strongly to our financial system. So banks get it right. Banks also understand risk very well. So they'll get the top of that. People with the most money, they'll train them, right, how to use the things. The challenge are the unbanked and the people that don't have an identity. And then we still are disaggregated because most of our identity is done through our driver's license system. And we're working through that. It's more connected than it used to be, but we don't have a national identity system. And that one, again, is libertarian. I get a little kind of wonky on because I'm like, I used to think that's okay, but our systems are so designed to know who you are that if you don't have the levers in place to make sure that you're accurately identifying people into a system, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And one thing that people don't think about when you're talking about with kids is they create what they call a synthetic identity. So you have a 10-year-old who has a social security number because that's what everybody has a social security number now, but you're not monitoring their credit because why would you? They're 10. Somebody will take their social security number, create a fake identity around them, and you don't know until they apply to go to a wonderful college that they actually have a mortgage in there in arrears. And you're like, my kid was 10, how did that happen? So the idea of being very laissez-faire about this is a bit, we're not going to be able to be those people anymore. But we haven't quite figured it out. There's a group that's been kind of in the news lately. It's called ID Me, and he's doing work with the Veteran Affairs Department and the IRS. There's some press in February that about the idea of doing a selfie for identifying yourself on your records. That wasn't a mandatory thing, but it wasn't reported that way. I guess, I don't know why I was like gone when he called and asked if he could talk to me about this. And so I was like, okay, I'm just gonna put all the bad news up front while I'm talking to you on the phone, because I'm like, what happened? Like, why are you in trouble? And he said, well, because I had these government contracts, he basically was advised, because I kept trying to say, legally, could you not talk about this? And he said, well, I was advised to kind of not get mad. And I was like, it's your company, I'd get a little pissed. But the idea was that he was being conflated by saying that he was doing one-to-many, which meant that he was using social media to identify people. And he says that is not absolutely accurate, because I've talked to him about this twice. But the idea to one-to-one was that is a gating mechanism. That if you're willing to put your own identity by taking a picture, the percentage of people they thought that would not be willing to do that if they were a criminal was, relative. It was a good margin of error. And then they caught 100,000 criminals in his own system. So it's been really interesting. I'm just starting to comb through the data points that he shared with me, and a lot of it's COVID driven. So the challenge is we threw a lot of money from the feds into the state system. The state systems weren't prepared for this at multiple levels. And as always, the criminals figured it out first. And this is a data point that the CEO told me, I have not validated it, but I love it, so I'm gonna repeat it, is that more people received unemployment in the state of Michigan than live in the state of Michigan. you're like, that seems like a pretty easy one to go at. And I said, why aren't we fixing this? And he said, there's no incentive mechanisms right now. So that's one of the things that we're starting to look at from a perspective. I'm interested from the identity perspective. I have some colleagues that are looking at it from the unemployment insurance perspective. But it's important because we are going to become more and more dependent on our identity being who you say you are and validating that.
I mean, there's a flip side to that too, is that with more of that identity protection, maybe a national identity scheme, whether or not it be a card or fingerprint or a facial recognition and all those, I mean, we typically will get blowback, which will talk about privacy issues. So how do we balance that?
Well, so I love Clear. I travel a lot, and I love the Clear system. I love that they're going into arenas and stadiums, and they're making it easier. But now that means that I'm using a gating mechanism, which is I'm giving them my identity, I'm giving them lots of information, and I'm giving them cash to get to the front of the line, right?
Yeah.
And I'm willing to do that, and I'm willing to pay for it. What do you do for the rest of the system? And again, the Pareto principle, you're going to get 80% of the people that will migrate into a system, and there are going to be 20% that we're going to have issues with it. And some of them, actually, there's some really interesting cases that churches are working on in areas where, like, one of the things that happened during COVID, I'm going to localize this for me in Washington, is we had these tent cities that popped up. And then the mayor would decide, they became a health hazard. They would go to clear them out and move them. Well, they weren't always done with the most of finesse. So they would pull all these people's belongings out, basically just throw them in the trash. And how do you have an identity when the government entity is just throwing all of your stuff in the trash, and now you don't have you probably aren't driving, you don't have a birth certificate, you don't have a lot of ways to identify yourself. And so we have a couple churches in Washington that are actually working with NIST to try to figure out a way that we go back and basically, how do you predate into a system like that and not allow people to get tagged out of a system because they can't identify themselves? And that also happens, with a lot of our migrant communities. So there's a lot of really interesting challenges. I would like to solve the big part of the problem, like anybody who's willing to voluntarily go, and get themselves in the system, let's take them out so they're not part of the value proposition we have to pay for, or we have to figure out the tougher parts of that equation.
Right. Well, I mean, what you say is really interesting about people that have been dropped out of the system, because there's a number of people who are, off the grid or whatever. And of course, not knowing about them means that we don't necessarily have the obligation to take care of them in any social welfare sense. But if they're not there, then it's not really a deficiency in terms of us. It's just simply that we've decided they don't exist.
I was talking to a woman at the Federal Trade Commission before that call earlier, and she's going to get me the actual data point. But she said it was really interesting how many people didn't have an email, that they just never needed one until the system basically said, now, the only way you can get what you are asking for from either the local or the federal government meant you had to sign into some sort of network operation. And so for the first time, they were actually getting emails, which is old technology, right? But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. But I mean, you can see sometimes it's not just people who are doing this just by default or whatever, that there might be entire segments of populations that are that I'm getting a little tinfoily with my hat on right now, but that they might decide that certain segments are just not recognizable and they don't have an identity.
I think there's always got to be a way to work through that process. And that is not the way people like to solve for things, but I think you need to have that exception capability. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule, and because now we're talking about people. We're not talking about widgets, so we need to know that there is always going to be, candidly, a help desk over here that does something. I do have one of my colleagues who's very early on, he just got a privacy book that's coming out, and it was right after 9/11, and they were making us, we just weren't used to this whole process. And he was like, I bet they've got to have some way I can get on the airplane without showing my driver's license.
Right.
So Jim was out in San Francisco coming back to Washington, and he took his driver's license, put it in an envelope, licked it, put it in the mail in front of everybody, and he said, I still think I can get through faster than this guy. And their exception system at the time, he got on the airplane faster than the guy with his driver's license. So somebody at San Francisco, he probably knew that it was, they knew what they were doing. But it's important to have that one element where if you can just say, I mean, I always think this is crazy because I'm on airplanes all the time. I'm like, what do you mean I have to leave all my stuff behind? How am I going to get anywhere if I don't have my driver's license and my phone is usually what I think.
Yeah. Interesting. So in terms of this sort of policy or, an identity protection policy, cybersecurity, where is the United States in terms of comparison to other countries? Are other folks, do they have this solved, or are we just in the same boat as everyone else?
So we solve it for economic reasons as to who can afford better technology. So I'm thinking of Apple specifically. Apple is very advanced in the Apple wallet. And more things are getting designed to go on the Apple wallet. The area of DC that I live in is not the best place to have a handbag. I learned that really early on when I was watching the police Twitter feed. It was always like, stolen purse. And I was like, I'll solve that. I will no longer have a purse. So I just have I've got everything's either on my phone or, I just don't carry a purse much anymore. And so I very much value my Apple wallet. But it's interesting how, we were talking about Estonia a little bit earlier. Estonia, when they were attacked, really doubled down on the idea of everything getting digitized, all their records being digitized. And so they kind of went the opposite. They were like, if you're gonna be here, we're gonna have to be able to digitally identify you. So there's a lot of studies being done in areas like Estonia where it's a petri dish. It's, because they were told to sign up and they're good that way. Nordic people are so good that way. They're just like, sure, I'll do it. So, looking at those areas and then seeing what the net effect has been on their different economic programs and government programs, because they are a smaller community, but all their banking is electronic, but that also means that makes them very vulnerable to your earlier cybersecurity question. Is that once that goes down, you need to make sure that somebody's got the backup, and everybody's like, oh, it's in the cloud. I'm like, yeah, but the cloud's just somebody else's computer, so we want to make sure that's working.
Yeah, and can't you get citizenship in Estonia without living there?
I don't know.
I think you can, and the reason why I'm interested in that, because as political scientists,
can you? You can.
You can.
Okay.
Yes.
Peanut Gallery says yes. You can get citizenship.
But that changes the whole concept of statehood and country and nationality. If I can be a citizen of Estonia and live here. It's just,
I don't know why this became such a big thing. Even though everybody was going to Lisbon during the pandemic, I guess it just was easy to get in Portugal. Okay. But Portugal has what they call the golden passport. You pay your way into the system, and they tell you where you have to live. They have areas they want to develop, and they're like, why not tell a bunch of rich people that they can have an EU passport, they pay their way into the system, but they have to go to an area where we want to get actual economic development. Nobody's making you go to.
That's just paying for your citizenship a little bit further, but you're still having to live there, right? And Estonia,
not really.
You just have to pay for it. You just have to pay for it.
I mean, Eric Schmidt doesn't live in. Where did he golden passport into a place where they didn't?
I'm going to ask one more question that is very, very local, Racine. Got a smart cities designation a couple of years ago, smallest smart city in the United States, And one of the things that they've done is that they've initiated an experimental program for an autonomous vehicle, something that will, at least at this point, perhaps just go down Main Street or have, but so it's experimental, definitely, working with UW-Madison and Gateway Technical College and of course the city. And then I couldn't help then just not too long ago, you had a conversation about autonomous vehicles.
Grayson
Brulte, yes. And talking about, what was the future for AVs and things like that. And I think one of the things that surprised you, and it surprises me even more because I still don't understand why, was how this technology for autonomous vehicles could also could impact, I think, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. He made this connection to all these other things. What does all that mean?
Well, let's go with the first part and then we'll get to the second part. I loved the first part of that, and I wasn't quite sure I get where he was going, but I'm not sure it's going to work out. So Grayson's a really interesting guy who actually started in Beverly Hills working on the regulations in that area, and then he got enamored with Florida, I like to say in the South apparently, and what was interesting, it was a conversation I was having with a friend about the villages, just about something completely different about the villages, and he said, you need to meet my friend Grayson because he's doing all this autonomous vehicle research in the villages, and I was like, why? And he goes, well, first of all, they all drive really slow there. So it's great. I mean, because they're just naturally, like, it just kind of simmered everything down. You're not dealing with, except for, I guess, all the guys in the Ferraris, but they're outside of the gates. And he said they were doing the testing, and that the older population there would actually come up and say, I'm really interested in this because I don't like not being mobile. I don't like being trapped inside my house. And I like the idea, I may not want to go that far, but I want to be able to go places. And so he just thought it was a great place to go in and really start to test the rules. And the idea of doing it at a slower mile per hour was actually ideal.
Yeah.
And I'll get to the second part of that, but there was an article I read last week, which I thought was really interesting, about how it was the auto industry that created the regulation of jaywalking. So back when they created vehicles, they realized kind of the similar situation that you have with autonomous vehicles is it was the humans not doing what they're supposed to do. They're off being crazy, being humans. And that was causing the first initial accidents with the original autos on the road. And so they went and lobbied to make us go to crosswalks and then make it illegal to walk out in front of a car. And so it was our fault, not the car's fault. And so the autonomous vehicles are learning. We're here, we've seen with the Tesla case and, the similar situation, which is, they can only train for so many scenarios, and we know because we're human and we do dumb stuff all the time. Like, how many stupid things can we do that involve a vehicle?
Unlimited.
And I'm still not. I don't know that I want to be in a car without any sort of way to grab a hold of the vehicle. But I drive a 5-speed, so I actually like to drive. So I'm not the best test audience on that. But I think the concept of it, and especially when you look at the statistics around accidents, are very interesting. I worry, though, it's kind of weird talking earlier about how kids don't look at maps, they have no idea where they're going, and they just follow their device. I mean, think about it if we ever get to a point where, like, you're just in the back of the car, people are just going to sit in the back of the car, and it's not going to go anywhere, and they're not going to know what to do. I mean, but that's my aged response to that. But I do think there's a lot of positives to what's coming in AI. To his point about, he was seeing kind of a gaming mechanism that now you're in the back of the car, you need to do something. There's going to be a bunch of things that you'll want to do on a screen, which will then get you to then wanting to use cryptocurrency. That's because he's a Web3 kind of guy.
But it seemed logical is that you have a vehicle that you don't need to drive, and so if you're trying to monetize it beyond just driving, is that you would have other things that you could do in the car, maybe even advertising or all of this sort of. So it would involve a lot of different tech that would be in there besides just sitting there.
But if you're that far along, it doesn't take much of a leap to get to the metaverse because you don't even know where the hell you are anymore.
Right, that's true.
You're just in the back of the car looking at a screen, and then you show up somewhere. Well, why even bother leaving? Like, just stay home.
Well, we might get there. We might get there. So this is, I told you I was going to get sucked in, and I certainly did. This is an excellent conversation. And we probably need to go and have a long,
see what the people are
long
thinking.
discussion.
Thank you guys for being here.
I would like to, well, first of all, let's give Shane a hand. And we have time to open it up if people have questions. I think Gia has something that looks like a mic, but it doesn't. And so if you have questions, we can do that. Or I don't know if there are any online, but if there are any questions.
Over here, Gia.
Hi, I'm Adele Edwards. I'm the Chief Information Officer.
Wait. You were doing very well in your enunciation, by the way.
Adele Edwards. I'm the Chief Information Officer at the City of Racine. My question to you is, in the next 10 years, how do you see life for the average citizen changing if the city that they're interested, that they live in, is trying to improve their lives? What are some of the big things that you can see coming?
I would think, and I actually have a whole bunch of questions for you. So I would think city services becoming more efficient, and in that would be the communications element. So, the frustration people tend to have, you think about, like, it's like going to the doctor, like going to do anything with city, government. I think I'm going to take a book and a bunch of things. I mean, believe me, DC government, there's a whole nother level of fun. But the idea of the efficiency of being able to use the system, and again, with that idea that I'm more than happy to learn the, like, I don't know how many of you guys do this. Remember when we used to have like Rolodex cards? I used to actually do like, it's a 4, 7, 6, 2, like I would know the codes that you would have to go through to get from the dialing the, to my best friend Betty, who was actually going to solve my problem. So, are we going to be able to take that, system and solve into the process as electronically or digitally as possible, and people are comfortable with that, they feel that the information is secure is probably the top priority because you're a lot of times going to be dealing with financial things, I would imagine. Again, also being able to, chat bots, being able to solve for things that you, and again, allow them to have an exit out into a human entity if they get frustrated, because, I just can game a chat bot if I'm in a bad mood, just get it going. But I think as long as they feel like it's a net positive, that they are getting better services, for the money that's being spent on technology, and they feel like they're doing what they want. A lot of times you're not solving for very difficult problems. So the idea of just making sure that you're having efficient mechanisms to get the information flow or the final outcome is ideal. And then I would love to hear kind of what you guys think is worth spending the money on right now, as far as like where you're finding the aggregated data. Are you going back and looking at your records, or are you just going with clean slate moving forward? Because I imagine you have like lots and lots of data points, but you're like, do I even bother to digitize some of this old stuff to find my patterns, or am I just going to start from like 2020 going forward when I get my new systems in place?
Thank you for the opportunity. So the city of Racine, like a lot of cities, has done a lot of different projects to do things. So we've actually are using a software package to collect the issues that the citizens have. And then that helps us understand what their issues are, but also how many of them are, what part of the city it is, how frequent there are, those types of things. But I'm very new to my position, and so what I'm trying to do is kind of figure out what we've done to tell a story, because my understanding is when you're working with people, people communicate through stories. They always have since the beginning of time. And so figuring out what the story of Racine is that's different from any of the other small cities in Wisconsin or the United States, and then what the citizens' issues are, what they see as their biggest problem. Because I've been to smart city conventions and everybody talks about trash and traffic. And I don't know, trash is still an issue, it seems like, in every city, but we don't have a major traffic issue. We're lucky with that, but we have other issues. And so I want to make sure that our solutions are citizen-based, but also, to your point, that if there are issues in how we are serving the citizens, we need to move as many barriers as possible, make it as easy as possible to get your permit process, to come into the city and figure out what you can and cannot do, because every city has different rules. So those are some of the things that we're doing.
That sounds really fun to me. I could go shadow you for a day and see what you're up to. One of the issues, going a little bit back to 5G, is actually pole permitting. It's this huge issue. You wouldn't imagine how much time I end up talking to people that are either an internet service provider or a telecommunications provider about what they're going to do about, everybody has different rules about poles and who gets to attach to poles and who has to pay for the pole replacement. And it's a whole new, that's a whole new level of fun. If you haven't had it yet, I'm sure you will be talking about the poles. Right, poles are very important. And permitting and all of that stuff. So yeah, I'm curious. Okay, when Peggy invites me back, you and I will have to chat more about that.
Yep.
I do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
On the live stream. So we have a question: separating crypto from blockchain.
Okay.
SEC and the Fed seem to have accepted the role of blockchain in society. As regulation comes, what do you think will be the role of blockchain in smart cities?
So just for level setting, blockchain is a distributed ledger, which is great because it keeps a record, right? The importance is making sure that you agree that the record is being kept accurately. So there's a little bit of a lore or a myth that you can't in any way mess with the blockchain. And now those clever criminals, I really just want to pay them dimes on the dollar. So maybe like, can you just get into my sandbox here and tell me what I'm doing wrong? Because they're figuring that out in different ways to do the gaming aspect of it. So it's important that everybody agrees on the mechanism and that the mechanism is tight and that we're not finding ways to mess with it. I just am not enamored with blockchain. I know a lot of people are. Going back to my being in the domain name addressing space, every time you query a domain name, there is a record kept of that. And that is done on a distributed ledger. Hence, if you wanted to call it a blockchain, it's basically a version of that. Nobody was super excited. I mean, I guess except for Google. Google likes to look at all that stuff and then tell you where to send your ads. On crypto, it's important to have that security element and the tightness on the ledger. That's the only way the government's ever going to really get to where they want to go. I mean, it's interesting because there's so much interest in it that they finally have kind of given in, and you're seeing members of Congress are getting much more interested in it. There's a crypto caucus, and I love innovation, so I think it's great that they're having the discussion, but I also don't want them to do what they are native to their thought process, which is immediately regulate it. Let's not regulate it. Let's think about how we can utilize it, and then, are the current laws, can we work through the process with current laws, or do we need any new regulation or law around that? So I hope that answers that question.
We'll bounce around the room, and then we do have another on the live stream.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. My name is Nicole Sadao. I'm a founder of a startup, Alltries, and so I'm kind of asking this question for startups. Is there a magic formula for startups as far as kind of getting their security in place right at the beginning, and how that grows as we grow into becoming that real company we're striving for? What does that look like?
Are you asking from a cybersecurity perspective? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, can I ask, what does your startup do?
So we help volunteers track and verify their volunteer data so that they can get into colleges and court-ordered community service, that type of thing.
That's very important because you need the validation to be considered valid, right?
Yes.
Actually, this woman I was talking to at the Federal Trade Commission, we were talking about this from a privacy perspective, but it would fall into cybersecurity as well. We were just saying how it's interesting that when we think about, I'm going to move to privacy for a second, then I'll move back to cyber because you'll see the parallel. On privacy, for those who follow this area, the European GDPR rule has, in theory, it kind of shook everybody because they had these gigantic fines, in theory, like that you're going to have to pay. And so all these people that do risk analysis in great big companies said, well, I'm not paying that. So somebody go figure out how we get in line with all these new European rules. And then California tried to do a version of that. But we're still just like puppies with our paws all over the place here in the United States. We can't figure out if it matters or doesn't matter. And so I was using that example to say for privacy, the big guys don't want to pay the fine, so they've gotten their act together, which is bled from Europe back to the United States. I said, what about the small and medium guys who are like, okay, I have X amount of time, X amount of dollars, I'm trying to get Y done. Is privacy a priority for me? And so we were just talking about how there's yet to be kind of that best practices where you hand it to somebody, and we're slowly getting there. I forget, there's this conference that was in DC today. I've completely forgotten, because I was like, the guy at the airport yesterday was driving me nuts. I was waiting for the plane, and he's just yapping in all this different ridiculous verbiage that didn't exist 5 years ago, which I've been working on privacy for at least 25 years. And I was just like, oh, it's just buzzwords. What do they mean? And I thought, well, okay, maybe because it's become an entire group of people that can do, they advise and they're consultants on just, how to put your privacy policy together. So now there's a similarity because there's the privacy and security are a yin and a yang, right? You really can't have privacy without security. For security, it's, I always think, don't think about it too differently than when you're leaving your house. There's areas originally it was considered the moat and castle system. So, enterprises would be, as long as they've got big enough moat and I have enough alligators in the moat, people will never make it into the kingdom. Well, that's not true anymore. So it's important to have a moat. It's important to have that front level of security. It's important to lock your front door. Mom, I keep telling her that, but she doesn't do it. So it's like you need to have the initial locks on your system. Two-factor authentication is a huge barrier to entry, and a lot of times it's like any other cybercrime is just like regular crime. There are petty criminals will always just avoid the locked door and go to the unlocked door. The guys who just walk around and grab on doors of cars until they find the one to get quarters that they actually bother to get out of cars. You want to be, at least at the minimum, more secure than whoever else is doing something similar to you, so they go bother them and stay away from you. That's your baseline. The other thing is, I call it data bloat, so you don't keep more information than you need. And that's a fine line because you are validating people. So you want to have accurate records, but you need to decide in your governance, how long you're going to keep those records and be very transparent and accountable. And you probably want to be able to be auditable in that. And the reason why you don't want to hold on to more information than you need is that the only people that really make money on long sets of data are criminals. They love lots and lots of data. It gives them all kinds of things to go make up all kinds of different bad ways to make your life miserable. You want your authenticity to be, accurate information, but tell them it's going to time out after 3 years, after 5 years, whatever you've decided is that point. And then you want to make sure that that information is no longer available on your system. That makes you more secure just by default because you don't have as much information to go after. And then you need to, and then there's, and we're getting better about not having this whole layering effect that we've had where you had, Norton antivirus is like, how many times have you gotten the invoice for something you've never bought? We're in this challenge where people are like, oh, okay, I need to go buy that. Go with who you trust. And I would say cybersecurity, the most important cybersecurity is what you will use. So either if you're on an ISP or like a system, depending on, talk to the people that are your network operators, ask them what they recommend, and you want to be able to have, again, that human intervention. If something's not working, who do you go talk to? It's like, for me, it's like my car. I'll drive my car to the dealership. They're like, Ms. Tews, you really don't need to drive your car. I'm like, but I trust you. So I'm here, and they're like, it's not that big of a deal. But I would rather that I overreact and get the right response than not know where to go to solve my problem. So I would say you need to have kind of your trusted advisor group there. And then make sure that the areas where things need to be cabined off are, where those are, and where your and even if it's a cloud operator, you just need to know where the information flow's going on that and feel good about where and don't feel bad about asking a million questions. Your job is not to be a cybersecurity expert. Your job is to ask a lot of questions and feel safe about where your information is being kept.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
My name is Isaac Coe. I'm in the annual fund here, so I understand the pain of trying to talk to donors without email addresses. But my question is more, what does Web3 change for us, like on the day-to-day? You were saying it's kind of like with WW going back to HTTP. Are we no longer using WW? And could you use YouTube as an example? What does the Web3 version of a video streaming platform look like versus what we currently have?
So that's why I'm using that example of it. Critical mass, you go to YouTube because it's easy to find, and so everybody else goes to YouTube because it's easy to find. I really wish I could remember the name of Frank McCourt's group, I just can't think of it. But their challenge is, once we decentralize, what is the information flow mechanism to find everybody again? So even though you don't have the email address, you probably have a relationship element where you can get the phone number or you can get the assistant's number. Blah, blah. So, if we're going to want to, and I do think there's a lot of kind of envy in the breaking of the platforms that we're currently in, and I am not a fan of that. I think if you want to do something different, do it better. And so I'm all for that. If you want to advance by being faster, smarter, more efficient, have a better way, I feel safer on your platform, give me something that is a market entity that makes me want to leave A and go to B. But to break A because you're mad and pouty, I think is a terrible idea. And we're dealing with that right now in legislation actually at the federal level. There are some states that are starting to go after it at the same level, and we're seeing it in Europe where they're basically, in Europe it's called the Digital Markets Act, and they just want to slow progress until they can figure out how to run ahead of us. And there are some people in the Web3 space that are trying to espouse all this innovation, but I'm not sure that they're innovating with the net positive result of not trying to break someone else down. And that might be because of the people I've met with, but I think we should be perpetually innovating, more security by design in everything. And that, we're starting to see the government is getting very serious about the security by design, which we will all benefit from, because you want security to be native to what you do. It's a kind of to your question of when you're doing plugins, it gets kludgy, and that's why it's always easier to use one system that knows how to talk to each other. Now, I mean, I think about it like when I go to my house and I'm like, first I want to be super smarty pants and do my own Wi-Fi system, except for it won't talk to my router, then what's the point? Like it's like, that was stupid. So I think with Web3, the question is that elegant efficiency of how do we migrate to something that's new and different and unique and makes crypto seem as seamless as any other process you go through. I mean, banking's not very seamless. It's kind of a pain in the ass. So if whoever helps us get to that seamless element, and I mean, if you're probably a Venmo person or somebody that uses Zelle or, so there's a whole generation of people that are much more efficient at that type of, system. If you change that currency from dollars to something like to ETH, some people that'll make a difference, some it won't. And then the distributed ledger entity is just, I mean, there's a lot of things actually in the government space which is very well designed to go on a distributed ledger. Ohio is working on doing that for their VINs. So when you actually, it's basically the idea of a birth to a death certificate for a car. So you'll able to actually know from the moment a car is not even just purchased. You can go back to the GM or the Ford or the Volvo records coming into the United States, and that way you have an efficiency and an effective way to know if it's ever been in an accident, who's owned it. Do you actually have the ability to transfer that car from person A to person B? And that is a beautiful, elegant way of using a distributed ledger that is very efficient. One thing that's interesting about the group that is doing that is they were telling me how when you're in a car accident, the faster you can get that car out of if it gets totaled, out of the junk lot, the actually better it is for environmental reasons, because if you don't get a car out of the system in 30 days, it will become basically just a big block of iron or whatever the entity is, a lot of plastic, I guess, these days. And so then you can't do anything with that car. And where if you can get it off the lot and back into, even though it might be totaled, you could get certain elements of it fixed. And that is probably because a lot of it's electronic these days. It's more chip driven, like you just have to go get that computer part, get it back in. I caught the joke at the time because they were in Illinois, they were saying, get those cars to Kentucky. It's just like getting it to the next place. The challenge is actually in getting the bank to agree to release to the insurance company the title to whoever ends up with the car so they can fix the piece so they can get the car from Ohio to Kentucky. If the bank is slow on the go there to the insurance company, then the car can't move, and that means that the car becomes just a piece of junk versus getting back into the actual auto system or being able to use any of the parts. And so they actually went, and they had one banker who had a lot of money in the system, didn't think it was a big deal, and they said, do you know how many warehouses of titles you have in just this bank alone? And they walked down to like the 12th floor, and this guy said, we spend over $1 billion a year on warehouse space for titles. So it has a whole level of supply chain management efficiency. It's not technically Web3, but it is an entity of what you talk about when you talk about Web3, of like getting our whole ability to digitize government records and entities like that, have a level of efficiency that just a lot of the inefficiency evaporates, life becomes easier, sunshine, rainbows, unicorns, all that good stuff.
Unicorns.
Everybody wants a unicorn in their backyard. You've got a question in the back too.
What are some top smart city tactics and options to both mitigate and adapt to climate change?
Definitely sensors are probably number one. I think we don't realize until after the fact the patterns that we see. We're definitely seeing that with weather. I mean, like so the fact that we knew it was going to be super windy today was, so preparing for that is a key one. Inefficiency in the system, and I imagine that's one thing that the Racine system is seeing is where you end up spending a lot of time, money, and revenue that is not an efficient use, or that could be used somewhere else for the value of that dollar or that time perspective from either employment or resources are I think probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are really huge. And then the audit function sounds a little crazy, but the ability to go in and do the look back and see where the information flow is going, because that's where I think a lot of the citizens get very frustrated. They've been seeing something happen and they're like, I've told you this is a problem, and it isn't until you sometimes go back and look at the audit function and you're like, actually, when you looked at how many citizens said, we had 82 complaints about that, but we didn't have them all in the same place. And so having the ability to take the records and then you can start to see the patterns of behavior is again, allows you to use your time, money, and energy much more efficiently. I think those are the top ones. And you've got a question in the back here.
Thank you. My name is Crystal. I'm a senior here, and I'm currently taking my senior seminar class. So I wanted to get your insight on the project that I'm looking at. So I'm doing a policy analysis on surveillance capitalism, which, if you guys didn't know, that's the commodification of personal data, specifically with the goal of making a profit from that data. And so I guess a good example of this would be Target almost got sued by a parent because the parent noticed that Target was giving their child coupons for diapers and baby bottles and things like that. And they were like, my child is not expecting. And it turns out that their child actually was, and Target was pushing these coupons because they had searched up things about pregnancy. So I wanted to get your insight on how state and local level governments can regulate technology as it relates to surveillance capitalism without disrupting the flow that you were talking about. And in addition to that, do you think that as technology continues to advance, will it be able to coexist with our notion of privacy and our notion of democracy?
Well, first of all, Crystal, congratulations. Well, I can't, it's like, do I say best wishes? Because you're not quite done, but you're getting almost, right? You're getting close, you're almost done. That is great. So the Target case was a really early indicator, and a lot of people talking about it. Have you seen the John Oliver piece he did on Saturday? Okay, so go into YouTube. John Oliver did a whole piece on data brokers. It's about 20 minutes long, and it is fantastic because he does it in that great John Oliver style where he takes something and then he just pulls the thread and he talks about where all the data goes for these data brokers. And he ends up, he does 3 fake campaigns, and he actually followed it to 3 people inside the US Capitol who were clicking on these campaigns, so definitely worth your while. Surveillance capital is a tough one, and because we're still in this area, and it is mostly in the data brokers, where people don't completely comprehend the information that is flowing off of their decisions. So I'm a big proponent on transparency and accountability and then auditability. So I will say, you can tell me you're the devil and you're going to steal all of my information off of my phone, but as long as you tell me that ahead of time, I will believe you. I would then probably choose not to do any work with you, but I wouldn't want to know that ahead of time. So the transparent element to our the terms of use are just terrible. Our terms of use are so long that you could probably get your PhD before you could read most of them, right? That's a huge problem. And then the accountability of once you agree to the terms of use, and I mean I've always said I'd like them to be in emojis. So like let's say there are 5 emojis. It's the and actually Apple's what they call ATT, Apple Transparent something, transparency something. They did that last fall. Tracking transparency, that's it. They tell you, in advance, and I just really didn't know how many apps were taking information that I had previously given them permission to. So if I hadn't opened up the app, it would say, do you want to give it your contacts? Do you want it your phone? Well, there's certain times where I'm using Waze, it needs my geolocation. Sometimes I'll question it. I'll think, why does that need my, and I'll say no. And the challenge is then sometimes the app will say, then you can't use the app, or they'll let you use it without that function. We've seen that with cookies in Europe once they ported the cookie notice over to the United States. Not a fan. However, since I'm spending much more time on European sites for some research I'm doing, I've noticed that if you say no to the cookies in Europe, they'll still let you get on the website. In the United States, pretty much if you say no to the cookies, they just kick you off. They're like, you're not gonna give us all your free data, go away. Well, eventually, I'm a big market-driven person. I think the market hasn't yet caught up to the fact that and more people want to say no to the data collection. And so that gets to the after the accountability is that audit capability. And to Facebook/Meta's credit, you're seeing that with the oversight board. They're doing a lot more audits. There are civil society groups that will critique the fact that the audits are not done in a symmetrical fashion. So it is difficult to do an apples and oranges. It's an apples and oranges comparison, not an apples to apples when you're looking at different platforms and how they share that information. I am a very, I understand what I'm getting into because I've been doing this for a long time, and I always say I wish it would tell me before I'm about ready to do something stupid, because it probably knows I'm about to. But I feel for people that don't have the insight that I have, and I think they should have the ability to say no or yes, whichever is the right answer for them. So that is when you first asked the question, though, I thought you were going in a different direction. So in surveillance, I was really truly thinking about how many places we were surveilled. I did have my Echo Dot was hacked over Christmas, which freaks everybody else out. They're like, what? And I go, I was sitting in bed, and all of a sudden, one of my speakers just started like really loudly playing the Michael Jackson song, Somebody's Watching You. So
Wow, that would freak me out.
I went downstairs and I unplugged it. And I went back to doing what I was doing. And they were like, weren't you freaked out? I'm like, no. Just, I knew it was always listening to me. And so that is one case. But early on, and this is like an early 2000s, it was a study. I was thinking about this when Peggy and I were first talking, I was not able to locate it. Somebody took the time to take the CCTV cameras in Los Angeles, and this is like before we were at the level that we were in surveillance, and figured out how many. A lot of them were not at the time secured. You could almost view like 90% of the city of LA, at least downtown LA, off of a CCTV camera just by pinging to see if the access was open, and then you could get full feeds, and you could watch everything that was going on in LA. And so that was like a study that I think a university did this like in 2004, 2005. So there are definitely layers to that. And then when you get to actual surveillance, it's a really tough question from I'm a big supporter of law enforcement, but I also believe that people have privacy, and when we get in these public spaces, you get a lot of questions about what's going on. I think it is probably always a good idea to let people know when they are in a surveilled area. I realize that's tough, but I'm like, so somebody who gets on airplanes all the time, I'm a real big believer in civility. I'm always worried, like the minute I get on that airplane, I'm like, please everybody take your place in society and write, as we're all getting into our seats. So I wish you lots of luck. Right.
Well,
We're getting
I think this is a good.
It's like
I think this is a good time
cocktail.
to stop. As I said, we're going to stick around for a little bit, walk around. I'm going to get her a glass of wine, and so please give her a moment just to regroup a little bit.
Thank you, Peggy.
But thank you again.